Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Film Score podcast. Today, my guest is Maya Shenfeld, who's really broken into the scoring world in the last year or so. Back in January 2022, she released her debut album, In Free Fall, which is a bit of a minimalist deconstruction in some ways, and made it on the top 10 lists of a lot of publications' best ambient, experimental, avant-garde releases of the year. And shortly after releasing that, she worked on the Oscar shortlisted documentary, The Flagmakers, doing a much more minimalist piece in the vein of minimalism like Philip Glass and Steve Reich, although taking it, modernizing it, changing it, making it her own. It's obviously not an ape of that. The Flagmakers follows several workers in a flag-making factory in southern Wisconsin, many of whom are immigrants, and it creates an interesting and organic way to look at the American dream and how it's changed and what these people's perceptions are, both from the immigrant standpoint and from the standpoint of people born in America as well. And so Maya and I talk about these two releases, about her long-standing interest in film music, which began when she was a young girl back in Israel, and continue the conversation from there. As always, you can find out more about Maya on her social media, and remember to always follow along the film score as well so you don't miss out on anything. And if you haven't yet, follow the show on your favorite service of choice, so you'll always get notified when there's a new episode out. Looks like February is going to be a very busy month. I'll have two more very big interviews coming up in the second half of the month, as well as perhaps a few other solo one-off episodes. It's been quite a while since I've done one of those. But until then, sit back and I hope you enjoy. Maya, thank you so much for joining me. How have you been?
Great. Thanks for having me. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing well. Look, I'm glad you could join me. I imagine that the last 12 months or so for you have been kind of a whirlwind. Go back to January of 22, you released your debut album in Free Fall. Not long after, you start working on The Flagmakers, the documentary we're going to talk about. Then I noticed that over the last few weeks in Free Falls, it came out to great reviews, and then it's found itself on a bunch of best of year-end lists, and now The Flagmakers is Oscar shortlisted. We'll find out in, I think, a couple days or a week whether it makes the final 5 cut. But that's a wild 12 months. How's that been? Has that felt a little surreal or too good to be true for you?
A little bit, yeah. It's definitely been a ride. It's been incredibly exciting. It's been just so positive. I didn't expect any of this to happen. I've been making music for as long as I can remember. And, you do things and you just, with the record and then the film, I always try to do the best work I can. And then you put it out in the world and you just see what happens, and I know it's not a thing I can control. So I've been very kind of high and excited and looking forward to more of, more music basically. After 22.
Yeah, and I mean, does it also, now that you've released all these things into the world and had this sort of reception or reaction, does that sort of set new expectations for yourself on every subsequent thing you create or release?
I'm really trying to kind of tune or turn that off, that voice in my head that said, things have landed so well with the external world this time, so I have to kind of keep up the expectations. I'm trained as a classical musician, and I've had a long run of love and hate towards that sort of rigorous old world training. But one thing that I do love that this kind of training has taught me is to always aspire to do very good work. And I think my own standards can be quite high. And then I just hope that it resonates with people, but I try to kind of and be genuine and authentic with the work that I do. And I always have very low expectations. So everything is a positive surprise. Yeah, that's kind of how I roll.
At this point, though, how can you have low expectations? I just saw an hour ago, I looked on Stereo Gum, and you were on among the best 10 experimental albums of the year. I mean, that's wild.
It is. It's totally wild, especially because I mean I'm just so I'm happy about it really because there's been so many. So I grew up in Jerusalem, and I've been in Berlin for 12 years now, which is a long time, but I still also am very connected to Jerusalem. And especially within Freefold, the first record, I worked on it for 3.5 years. And it's been quite a back and forth of trying to find the right sound and the right voice because I am classically trained, but at some point I also spent some time in India and experimented with classical Indian music. And then I got back to Berlin, and then I played in punk rock bands for a while, and then I kept on doing like avant-garde experimental music, which is what the focus was in school or in the academy here. So trying to come up like to develop my own voice that sort of puts together all of these influences has been a real challenge, and that's why it took 3.5 years, and it was beautiful to work on it. So I'm very happy that it landed so well with people.
Yeah, I bet. And yeah, I didn't realize that the extent of your musical influences and training were so broad. So was that difficult to, not necessarily distill them, because it's not like your works are taking, maybe overtly, they're not taking a piece from every single one of those, but like, how has that journey gone from like finding what Maya's sound is?
It has been challenging, to be honest, because there were days I was like, yes, electric guitar, distortion, bring it on, more distortion, and like no form. Or, I mean, microtonal music. I mean, we shouldn't refer to it microtonal, but like alternative tuning systems are things that I'm also interested in. And so trying to find a musical language that sort of like puts together everything. I mean, I'm still learning, I'm still evolving, which is why also like talking with you today is really interesting because on one hand, in 22, I released In Free Fall, the record, which for those of you who haven't heard it yet, it sort of unfolds a series of electroacoustic pieces for brass, analog synthesizers, electric guitar, a youth choir. It's pretty wild, very textural. And then the film score, it's chamber music-like, and it's written for piano and strings. And the starting point as a reference was minimal music, 70s minimal music, American minimal music. And also allowing myself to, after I finally, okay, this is my voice as an artist, as an avant-garde artist, this is what I do, allowing myself to write music that is a bit more tonal and Western and influenced by these genres that I love was totally fun, but in a way it's exciting to talk about it because it's two very different projects basically.
Yeah, it really is. And jumping into the starting off point that you mentioned for the Flagmakers, for some of the 70s, particularly American minimalism, I know that names like Philip Glass or Steve Reich came up as reference points early on. And obviously, you don't want to just ape or mimic their music. Creating something a little bit new, different, more modern, more contemporary. How did you go about doing that? And then how difficult is it to escape the shadows that people like that cast because they've had such an outstanding impact on minimalism and sort of on the Western avant-garde more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, they basically coined the genre, and I played a lot of this music as a guitarist, actually. I played Reich's Electric Counterpoint that was written for Pat Metheny at the time, and I also played Julius Eastman's Gay Gorilla as a guitarist, so I'm very familiar with the aesthetic and this music from the lens of a performer, actually, which has been helpful in understanding how this music works. In the production of the score and the film, we had really very interesting conversations because I love minimalism, but I also had to, both Cynthia and I wanted to understand, is this the right aesthetic? And how can, as like you said, how can we make it more contemporary? How can we have a bit of distance from it? We don't want to mimic, in Western music, we have major and minor, and so everything is limited and it's self-referential in a sense. It's very difficult to innovate, which is what In Free Fall was about. But then there has to be a way to make it your own, to find your own voice in that. And I think for the Flagmakers, although that was our starting point, I think the way we work with the strings and the sound, and there is, so everything has been recorded in the studio, but it's basically electroacoustic, so there's very subtle electronic processing. And I think this is something that I feel like gives it a different voice that is more contemporary and more like 2023.
And I don't want to take us on too much of a tangent, but can you describe a little bit more about the concept of the genre of electroacoustic?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it can mean a lot of things. It's kind of like it's a bit of a hype word at the moment, but it's just beautiful music. But the idea is that basically you record an acoustic instrument and you process it using digital or analog electronic tools. If you know Sakamoto, Ryuichi Sakamoto, I really like that piano with the electronic sub bass. I love that, What I do a lot in the Flagmakers is stop me if I'm nerding out or getting too technical.
No.
Okay. So what I love doing is I'm leaning a lot on harmony, which is something that is true for both my artistic music and film music. So it's choosing sort of like harmonic space and then maybe recording arpeggiated chords, writing a score that is more open for interpretation, and then using electronics to stretch and manipulate them. So making it more textural in a way.
Interesting. Okay, because it's something that I had seen particularly associated with your music, but then, it's also a term that I've seen bounced around, and part of this whole project is also just sating my own curiosity as well. So I appreciate you jumping into it. And yeah, I don't think it should be too nerdy for most people listening in, because this is already such a niche, nerdy subject matter in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, it's just super fun. It's just anyone at home, it's about taking your phone, using your recording device on your smartphone, or taking a contact microphone and putting it on a table, and then, making some sounds using coins or whatever, and then taking that. And then if you're into a little bit of like music production, putting it in some sort of a software, whatever you use. There are some great, almost free software on the market, and then just reversing the recording, adding more frequencies to it, stretching it, all of that. And it's like magic. Soundscaping.
I find that so interesting as well, because it seems to continue the trajectory of expanding what sounds that music can be made up of. You go even a century ago where it's very much like the traditional instruments we think of, and over the last, I don't know, 70 years or so, 80 years, like once you start hitting things like musique concrète, and then like the beginning electronic music of the 50s, 60s, 70s, like now all these things. I know some people find a repulsion to it because it's so different and it keeps getting different, but like seeing the world continually expand is very exciting. And not just hearing new sounds that you may have never heard before, but also taking what I think electroacoustic does as well is taking things that are far more familiar and making them a little bit different, changing them in ways we might not expect or might not be familiar with.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And electronic music production has advanced so much and is very a lot more accessible than it used to be back in the 70s or the 60s, which is very exciting. And this is part of something that one can use in their color palette for musicking. And since I am classically trained as a 20-year-old student in Berlin, I had a bit of this, a little bit of institutional critique of like, yes, this is all great. I love counterpoint. I love orchestrating. I love the big orchestra, all of that. But we live in the world with Beyonce and Jay-Z and Billie Eilish. And, and they do that all the time. I mean, I think in Bury a Friend by Billie Eilish, or is that Bury a Friend? Is that right? I think in one of her greatest hits, she was at a dentist's and she recorded the dentist drill, and that's a part of the song. So anything, any sound could be huge for production. And I love that.
Interesting. I actually know
Yeah.
that. That's very cool. And it's like really invigorating. I love hearing things that I hear, the first note, the first sound when it comes up, and I go like, what is this? Where does this come from? It's great. But stepping away from that a little bit, I know that you've had an interest in scoring for film or maybe for other media as well for a while. Where did that interest first arise for you?
All right, I'm gonna tell you that. I'm gonna answer this question honestly. I think it's been a childhood dream, to be honest. I have memories of myself being in third grade and watching. So the Jerusalem Cinematheque is quite an institution. So film was always very central in
Mm.
my upbringing, and there was an amazing sort of art house film library, and we used to borrow cassettes and then DVDs. And I used to, after watching like French and European cinema. I used to just go to the piano and play the music that I heard in the film, and I really wanted to do that. But it felt like there weren't very many role models of people studying composition. It was more like the traditional, like, okay, you're a guitarist, so you do guitar, you're a violinist. And so it took me a while to find my voice as a composer. After I moved to Berlin, I realized, oh, you can be a composer. That's a thing you do. And then I was like, so and then this film is basically the first major film project. I worked on an amazing short film earlier this summer as well, which was a 4-minute film. But this is my first film, and I got to it through I worked on some library music projects before, so I did work on music that is suitable for film, but from the other side. And this music that I composed for EMI's Productions Music Library has a life of its own. And the editor of the Flagmakers wanted to use one of my library music tracks for this film. And this is how Cynthia found me, basically. Cynthia Wade, the director.
I mean, did that surprise you? And I'll say a little preface, like I don't know as much about library music. My thought is always it's companies just placing it in, ads or spots, things like that. So when Cynthia mentioned that to me, that she found the piece of library music, the track Accelerate, and like loved it, I was surprised just because it seemed uncommon. So did that surprise you?
Yeah, because, the crazy thing is that also because there's a bit of a thing which I am now slowly totally going to own. I like making tonal music and I like making avant-garde music, and I also like playing punk, and that's my music practice. But there's a bit of a thing with some of my best friends and B-siders. In the avant-garde sometimes it's like, oh, you wrote tonal music, that's not allowed. So basically the library music project is released under a French name that is called Rouge Fou. So it's not even released under my name. And Cynthia really loved Accelerate, that she was like, who is this person? And she got in touch, and she's in LA, I'm in Berlin, we never met, and we scheduled a Zoom call. We had a really nice meeting, and I was like, yeah, there's no way it's gonna happen. And I was like, totally no pressure. If you want, send me the latest cut you've got, I'll send you some demos. And I was like, yeah, there's no way it's gonna happen. And then she was like, no, it's you're gonna do it, which is incredible. So yeah, that's how it started.
And I do want to return to that in a second, but first, mentioning there being like a condescension from people in avant-garde circles towards tonal music, and you kind of get that throughout all sorts of other genres and subgenres and styles of music elitism looking down on other types. This is like an unfairly broad question, but as someone who's gone through the schooling and interacted and been a part of so many different groups like that, why do you think that sort of elitism or looking down on things is so prevalent in music?
I don't know. There is a cool angle to it. As like, this is my belief and I'm gonna die for it. That sort of a thing. This is my school, and honestly, I don't know. I do know that in the digital age, there is definitely an impact of the way music is distributed that makes it, more difficult for artists to have so many different facets because of the way the algorithms work. And this is something that is talked about a lot. And then amongst artist circles, I think it's changing as well. If you'll talk to people who are 20 now, I get the sense that they're a lot more open. And then, there is a part of me that respects that, like, because, being really very good at making music, some people just really feel like you have to be sort of, it's almost sacred. There's only one way to do it, and that's the way you're going to do it. So I definitely, I get that. But it's just happens to be that my case that I like experimenting and pushing my own boundaries and, trying out things.
Interesting, and that's always been my preference in music taste as well. So I see the upsides that you mentioned, but I always approve of pushing boundaries in every direction. Saying that the algorithms can influence like artists' choices of what music to try sounds utterly dystopian and depressing. That's like a whole other massive conversation issue that we won't dive into.
That's a lot to navigate.
Yeah, but we'll jump away from that now. Going back to the Flagmakers and that first conversation with Cynthia when you were putting things together to her latest cut. I mean, maybe at that point that was what, earlier mid 2022, so that might have been, correct me if I'm wrong, it might have been your first time really doing that to picture in that sort of situation. So how did you approach putting some initial music together for her to listen to?
So what we did was I had more music that has not been released in the style of the project that she liked. So I was like, why don't you have a listen to that and see if there are other things that work in that folder, and I can start also composing to picture and send you some sketches and you can see how you feel about them. And I'm just going to mention that the Flagmakers is directed by two directors, Sharon Leese and Cynthia Wade, and they're both fantastic. And Cynthia took on the role of music supervisor, so this is why we're going to mention Cynthia a little bit more in this conversation, but Sharon has also been part of some of the conversation, and it was a pleasure working with them both. All right, so coming back to our process, we used earlier sketches, unused demos, and I created new ones that Hilary Batchelder, our fantastic editor, could use while they were editing the final cuts. Yeah.
So did they effectively like almost temp the documentary with those tracks of yours?
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
That's what we did. I have a lot of friends who score film in Berlin. There's quite a community here, and they're all wonderful. And I've had a lot of support also in this project. And one good advice I got in the beginning is like, do not go into the rabbit hole of temps. You're not going to come out of it. And so I was like, Cynthia is also trained as a musician. So she was very articulate about what she had in mind for different situations, like plucky strings, harp, and we worked from there.
Okay, and because it is quite a restrained sound palette, it's very much I think almost entirely piano, string quartet, harp, electronics, and I think there's a little woodwind in there as well. Having something so restrained in that particular palette, was that a choice made very early on between you two?
Yeah, because we wanted to record all the instruments live. And it's a short documentary. And actually, the whole process happened from the initial conversation until completion, we had 2.5 months. So it was very fast, maybe 3. So, I mean, it was clear that also there was something about the chamber music-like sort of approach that we took for the ensemble that felt right for the mood, atmosphere of the film. It wasn't about making something that is grand. It was about letting the story tell itself and supporting the narrative in this case.
Well, and that is very central to how the documentary plays out, even though the company that a lot of this occurs at is, I think it's like the biggest flag maker in the US. The music and the actual storytelling doesn't have a similarly large scope. It's the opposite. It's very intimate and personal. So it makes sense that the music would also do something similar. And because of that, we do really follow a few individuals primarily. But given that it's a short documentary as well, was there a difficulty in trying to keep one coherent sound or palette, give a unique sound or distinct sound to these individuals, all in about 35 minutes?
Yeah, so this is such a good question because it's something I thought about a lot. Because I know that this is purposeful music, but it was really important for me that each one of the cues would stand alone as a miniature, as a mini piece, that you could listen to it and there will be something to it, that it wouldn't be just a pad. Not that there's anything wrong with having just a pad, but yeah, so like you said, the film is 35 minutes, very short, and we're following 4 protagonists. And I don't know if one notices during the first time one watches the film, but there's about 22 minutes of music in the film, but very subtle in a lot of moments. And the 4 protagonists are quite different from each other. So it was important for me to create a sound for each one of them, but not to single out any of them particularly. And that was not easy, but I think we got there in the end.
So what are some of the things you did then to strike that balance?
So in some of the earlier versions, we had different instruments. For Sugar Ray had a different, we used the woodwinds for Sugar Ray, and it really complemented his narrative in a way. Yeah, we used the harp more frequently. We tried a lot of different things, and in the end it is mostly piano and string. And I think actually Sugar Ray's cue is my favorite one, and one thing that really helped to create a sound for each one of them was actually leaning on harmony. There is a key that really complements each one of the storytellers. So Radisa is in E flat major, Ali is in A flat major and minor, and Sugar Ray is in B flat. And so although a lot of music theory people would say, what are you talking about? The ratios are the same and there is no difference between B flat major and C major. I personally think that there is a difference between different keys. That's an emotional or a mood difference. And so I felt like by trying to kind of introduce different harmonies for each character, it helped sort of organize the film and shift the mood in a way that supports the events and the film.
Interesting. As the process went on, what were some of the conversations like and with you and Cynthia, and was it difficult for you going from creating your solo artist album to then working on something that was both more collaborative but also when you're scoring for film, TV, documentary, where the music is taking like a secondary supporting role to the larger project?
It wasn't actually, like, since it's something that I've wanted to do for a long time, it's clear to me that this is different, that this is not about me, but it's about the production, it's about the story, and most importantly it's about the protagonists and about supporting them in a way that's fair to them, and the directors, because they know I haven't been to Adder Flag. I only visited after the work on the film was complete already, so I had to really rely on Cynthia for sort of giving me the larger context of the story. The earlier edits of the film were a little bit longer, and that helped too, because I got to see different events and scenes in the protagonists' lives, and that really helped. But taking a supporting role was a shift that I was really happy to do, because that's what this project is about, and that it made sense,
And that actually raises another aspect that I was thinking about, where you mentioned that you hadn't been there during or prior to this process, but the documentary uses this flag making factory facility as sort of a vehicle to talk about the American dream and immigration and what that all means. As someone that obviously is not American and doesn't live in the country, did that give you a different perspective as, almost as an outsider in approaching the project?
My perspective is for sure probably different, since I haven't spent that much time in the US, and I come from a place that is, it's fair to say, it's a complicated place, especially Jerusalem. And as a Jewish person, I also live in Berlin. It's a third generation Jewish, Moroccan, Polish, Brazilian person. So a lot of these topics are resonated, and then the events that happen in the US have a massive impact on the rest of us, certainly on Israeli and Palestinian politics. And so I think the tapestry, the very nuanced tapestry that Cynthia and Sharon sort of weave together, tell a broader story about polarization and the complexity of immigration. And the American dream is a bit more particular, I think, as an idea. And so as someone who lives in Berlin, it was important for me to really connect to it and take it to heart, and also not be cynical, which it can be a position that one takes, it's like the American dream. And it was important for me to really think, how can I as an individual connect to this story from my privileged sort of, I don't know, privilege, but I'm a musician, I get to work on music, and I see that as a privilege. But I still understand the complexities of living in a place where you're not speaking your mother tongue, not even your second language. And
yeah, and it is an interesting point, particularly on sort of the sincerity with which the approach is, because I think it is very easy, especially now or recently, for people to be cynical about that. But given that the documentary focuses on individuals, in one sense, it does feel hard to have that cynicism, because there is that sincerity and like that truth within each one of them that does have to be a bit difficult to approach.
Yeah, and I just have to, I think Cynthia and Sharon did a fantastic job telling the story of, Radisa, Ali, Barb, and Sugar Ray, because in such a short time, there is the broader representation of what each one of them may or may not stand for, but also there's the individual story of the hardships one has as someone, migrants, working class, and the connection. I mean, these people consciously or unconsciously are making the American flag. So, I mean, their relationship to where they live in is so present. And it's interesting because, in Germany, flags are kind of a taboo.
Really?
People, yeah. Yeah, I think it's historically, being patriotism, and flags may come out for like a football game, but generally people don't often, it's not a big thing here. It's maybe even the opposite.
So seeing that aspect of the documentary, I mean, that almost come as a surprise to you, because I have heard in, you take England for instance, if someone just displays the English flag, that can also have taboos or certain things associated with it as well. So I mean, did it surprise you seeing the sort of prevalence of the flag in the documentary and like the meaning of it?
I think I wouldn't say it surprised me, because I think, in a sense, although I haven't spent that much time in the US, in Israel, you grew up very influenced by American culture, which is kind of fun because also all the films and the TV and, and some fun, drive-in and food stuff. There are nice things to it. So it didn't entirely surprise me. Yeah. And it's interesting how meaningful it is to them. And I think also, there are interesting things that happen with the flag also in the Jewish and Israeli context as well that can be also complicated, similar to the film. So I could connect with that as well.
As I thought about it, both listening to the music on its own, watching the film, and just sort of reflecting a little bit, I think that complication and the different ways you can think about, a flag, the American dream, things like that, comes through in the music as well, because except for, I think, really the cue exercise with Radhika, the music for the most part does carry an array of conflicting emotions. A lot of the times there's an optimism or there's a hope, but it's tinged in a sort of melancholy or somber feeling that does carry throughout the film and throughout the experiences of these individuals. So I assume that having that conflict inherent in the music was something intentional.
100%. Yes. I think it was intentional. I think while we were like at the weeds of like really working on it, the turnover and the process was so fast for me that I think it also happened intuitively, because this is where the narrative goes, and it's just so present. And I guess we can all connect to this ambivalence that one can feel towards one's own flag. In a sense, you want to be proud and you want to be grateful for what the place you live in gives you, but it also represents so much. So I think, the music moves exactly like you described it, in this space that is between hope and despair, and it's celebrating very small moments, but it's never really going sort of like major and celebratory, because it is a nuanced film and it needed a nuanced sort of approach also for the music. I think particularly the moment, there's this cue called the 4th of July cue. It's a moment in the film that Sugar Ray, it starts with Sugar Ray swinging his son in his backyard. And I really like it because the piano very subtly comes in with arpeggios that are sort of timed with the swing in the courtyard. And then they're transitioning into a 4th of July sequence with fireworks. And in that particular moment, before we see the celebrations of the 4th of July, Sugar Ray says, "But the country doesn't love you back. It doesn't love you back." And so you cannot sort of bring out the entire orchestra and the violins and just celebrate that moment. But there's a cognitive dissonance that happens there, if you know what I mean. It's very moving, it's very emotional, but it's not what you'd expect for the 4th of July celebration.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, where if you stripped out the context and showed just a short clip of some of these people handing out American flags and people having a good time and the fireworks going off, you would expect a big brass fanfare or something. And once you put it into context and you hear what Sugar Ray's talking about, and even around then, Ali has a phone conversation, a video conversation with his mother, I think, and he's very happy then, but his happiness also juxtaposes what life was like for him before, and there's just too much going on, pulling in different directions, where having that big fanfare victorious moment that you'd expect would be, it so missed the point and be almost insulting to the journeys and the feelings that these people have.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think from what I've been hearing from Sharon and Cynthia, I think this is the really special thing about the film, because I think a lot of people hear about it and they think it would be an entirely different film. And then they take 30 minutes out of their day and they watch it, and they've had wonderful responses from their friends and communities and filmmakers, and for good reason, because it does sort of unpack the complexity that we've just talked about. It's not just the most straightforward sort of patriotic essay about the American flag. It's exactly
Yeah.
not that.
I'll be honest, I had obviously known a little bit about it before watching, and there was a part of me that was like, oh, is this just going to be like a 35-minute sort of patriotic documentary? And one, I should have known better, but I'm really so glad that it wasn't, because if it was, it would be so superficial. But to move a little bit back towards the music purely,
Mm-hmm.
the cues in it tend to be like quite short, 1-2 minutes or so. And then I was listening to In Free Fall, and like a lot of the song lengths there can be 6-7 minutes. Doing both of those in a relatively short period, was there a difficulty for you going from these songs or these tracks that have a lot more time to develop versus something that really needs to build and hit an emotion in a minute and a half?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely challenging. It's a thing about commercial music as a whole that it needs to have in 1 minute and a half, you'd have part A of the cue, part B, part C, and somehow, like, you start with somber chords and then somehow, something happens and you need to change it entirely. Like, to be honest, I think it's really a skill to be able to do that, but it's also really fascinating. And I really want to embrace that form of, like, supporting the events, the picture, and being able to change the moods if necessary, and being that flexible. I think it's quite a skill for sure.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely is. And one more aspect of that, I know that at least as of now, there's no official release of the music, but I think there's, 13, 14 cues that you have together. Is that something that you're planning on doing?
We're definitely all open for it. Everybody has been super busy, so we haven't really sort of spent much time talking about publishing yet. But in my mind, I'd rather think that this music will come out at some point and has to work as well as it can. I mean, as you mentioned, some of the cues are, it's purposeful music. Some of them are 90 seconds long, some of them are 2 minutes, and some of them are even shorter. But I think it's a really special project to me, and we recorded it here in Berlin on Babelsberg's Corin Stage Studio, which is one of the, if not the oldest film scoring studio in Germany. It's a beautiful studio, and I think the recording engineer did a fantastic job, and the musicians were so good that I'd love for the music to be out there at some point, but who knows.
Yeah. And look, I'll say I've spent my fair share of time listening to things like grindcore, so I'm used to 20-second songs, but not everybody is. Is there a hesitancy for you, given some of the shorter track lengths, to have things sort of expanded upon? Or, for you, is it because, like, this is the music that was created for the film? If there's going to be released, that's what should be released.
I think I would extend some of them because they can have more body for sure. But it's also up to what Cynthia and Sharon might prefer. But definitely, sort of, my point of departure was like, it probably will be what it is if it comes out, and that's fine too. But I think there is room. I promise I won't make them into 8 minute tracks.
I don't know. People do love expanded score releases, so there's always an audience for it.
Yeah, the material is there. So, I mean, I have a bad joke, but yeah, yeah, some minimalist stuff. It's just a loop you just drag. No, it's not, but it could be. Just drag the loop to the right, and then, it turns into 3 minutes, but no. Yeah.
Yeah, and easy. You add a little processing here and there, and there you go.
Yeah, there you go. I wish it was that easy, but yeah.
Listen, I think that's a great spot to stop on. Maya, thank you again for jumping on to chat with me. It was great listening and watching the film, listening to your music, and also listening to In Free Fall. I always love hearing new things, especially I'm a sucker for minimalism too. Anyone who's listened to me a lot or talks to me for more than 3 minutes probably heard me talk about Philip Glass, so hearing anything that has even the vagaries of an influence from him, I'm a big fan of.
Thank you so much. I love talking with you. Thank you.